Kate was in tears. She hadn't seen her husband, Isa, in 2 days. Dr. John Watson knew where he was. So did Watson's wife, Mary. Everyone knew where he'd gone. Mary sat Kate down and told her that her husband, Isa Whitney, was addicted to opium. "Oh, yeah, I know," said Kate. "But he usually confines it to a day and comes home and I clean him up after he comes down." And you're okay with this?" Watson questioned. "Oh, no, not remotely. But have you looked into laws regarding women-initiated divorces in Victorian England? Because there are literally no laws regarding women-initiated divorces," Kate said. John Watson furrowed his brow. Isa Whitney was his friend and patient. He asked Kate how he could help, though he already knew the answer. 10 minutes later, he was heading out. Again. He had already had a long, long day at his clinic, and he was now going to an opium den, but not for the reason people usually went to opium dens. Watson pulled up outside the completely legal and legitimate establishment where people came to buy and use opium. It wouldn't be outlawed in Britain for another 20 plus years. The place was called the Bar of Gold. He took one look down the alley and turned back to his cabbie, asking the gentleman to wait for him. The man looked up and down the streets and calmed his horses. He told Watson to be quick about it. He didn't like this neighborhood. Down the dark alley, John located the discreet door. As soon as he opened it, brown opium smoke blasted him in the face. He grimaced and entered. After trotting down the wooden stairs worn smooth by years of shuffling feet, he found himself in a room lined with bodies. You would only know they weren't dead by the fact that some of them labored to look up occasionally, their glazed-over eyes barely registering a newcomer. Watson noticed the occasional orange glow of pipes around the room, but it was otherwise still. From around a coal fire at the far end of the room, a man sprang to life and rushed over to the doctor with a metal pipe, beckoning him to sit on a stack of pillows. Watson shook his head. He wasn't staying. He was just here looking for his Oh, never mind. There he is. Watson saw Isa Whitney perk up at the sound of the doctor's voice. John, I had no idea you were into opium," Isa burst as he struggled off a pile of pillows. "I'm like really into opium," he said. "You can probably tell." He motioned to his wrinkled, stinking clothes and unkempt hair. Isa glanced up the stairs to the entryway. "Wait, it's dark? What time is it?" Watson replied that it was nearly 12:30. "Oh, hey, since you're into opium and you'll understand that this isn't a weird question, what day is it?" "I'm not into..." Watson said, then gave up. "It's after midnight, so it's Friday, June 19th. "What?" "No, I thought you said it was Friday." "It's Wednesday," Isa Whitney replied. "I did say it was Friday, because it's Friday. You've been missing for 2 days. Your wife came to us for help. Why do you think I'm in a place like this?" Watson said, helping his friend to the door. "Oh, wow. That is bad. 1 pipe turns into 2, 2 turns into 4, 4 turns into a 3-day bender. You know how it is, Watson. You're into this too." Watson replied that he wasn't into... Wait. Isa probably owed something for sitting there smoking for 2 days straight. Watson would just go speak to the man at the front to settle up for his friend. It was while he was standing over the coal settling Isa's tab that he happened to look to his right at the man who was staring at him. A hunched man with an opium pipe dangling from his mouth. Watson turned back to the owner, but then something crossed his mind. He shot the stranger another look before turning to leave. "Wait a minute." Watson stopped, turned on his heel, and marched right up to the man who had been staring at him. "Sherlock?" I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. The clerk/drug dealer at the opium den cleared his throat, watching the interchange play out. The stranger was standing up, and no longer looked like a gaunt, old man with an opium pipe dangling from his mouth, but like Watson's one-time roommate and coworker, Sherlock Holmes. Watson stood there in disbelief. What was Sherlock doing? The detective wore an impish grin. There's no way Watson would have recognized him if he hadn't stared, right? Right? His disguise was good. Anyway, Holmes announced that he was there on a case. Watson stared back in disbelief. In an opium den? Holmes furrowed his brow. He told Watson to relax. Opium wasn't his thing. They both knew he was a cocaine guy. Yeah, we do, Watson replied. Holmes invited him to join the case, send his friend home, and get a message to Mary that he had met up with Sherlock. And by asked, I mean Sherlock told him to do all those things and meet him in an alley. 10 minutes later, after the cab had driven off with a note from Mary and Isa languishing in the back, Watson saw the stooped and elderly man limp out of the opium den and down the alley. Even with knowing it was Sherlock, he almost got lost in the disguise. For all of Sherlock's many, many oddities, when he committed to something, he could really pull it off. So, it's been a while, Sherlock began when he caught up to Watson and lost the old man act. It had been a while, too. When they last parted, Watson hadn't thought they'd next meet in an opium den. Watson laughed and assured Sherlock that he was only there looking for a friend. Sherlock laughed too. He was there looking for an enemy. An enemy? Sherlock nodded. He didn't even know who it was yet, which was rare for him. A man, a friend of his named Neville St. Clair, had disappeared from that den a week ago, and Sherlock had been there since, listening for any clues from the stupefied patrons. He had learned and seen many an unsettling thing, too. The proprietor, though he tried to blend in as one of the customers, seated visitors, then pushed something strong on them. If they survived, they were in it for days, the owner taking them for everything they had. If they didn't, he dragged them to the back, literally took everything they had, and helped the body into a trap door, which emptied somewhere near the corner of Paul's Wharf. On the right sort of foggy night, that's the way a good number of customers exited the establishment. Sherlock paused and squinted to see the cross street where they had been standing, and he let out a brief whistle. After another whistle answered from the fog, a dog cart emerged from the mist. Now, a dog cart isn't, as I initially presumed with way too much excitement, a cart drawn by dogs. It's a lighter horse-drawn vehicle that people use while hunting. It had enough room for your dogs to sit in the back. Sherlock's driver didn't have any dogs, and so Sherlock leapt in the seat. Well, you're coming, right? Sherlock said to Watson. I have rooms in Kent. You want me to go to Kent, Sherlock? I have a job. I'm married now. It's 12:30 a.m. on a weeknight, and I don't even know anything about this case. Sherlock was puffing his pipe to light it. And? The famous detective asked. Watson sighed. All right, I'll go. Sherlock sat back in the cart. Excellent. He told the driver that even he wasn't going to make Watson sit in the dog seat. The man who had been waiting for hours was free to go, so Watson could ride. In fact, he needed to leave on foot in this terrible neighborhood. Oh, and here's a crown for your troubles, Sherlock said, flipping the man a coin. Also, the man should meet him tomorrow at 11 a.m. for more servant stuff. Sherlock cracked the whip, and he and Watson shot off into the night, toward Kent, on their first adventure in years. It was an absurdly simple case, but it was one Sherlock just couldn't crack. A man by the name of Neville St. Clair had come to Kent 15 years ago. He had laid out a massive mansion and married a prominent brewer's daughter, with whom he subsequently had 2 children. He worked in London, and the family had a nice little life in the suburbs. Last Monday, Neville had left early for work in the city. He had 2 important meetings that day, and he had promised his son a box of toy bricks, so he had to get a move on. Almost as soon as he left, however, his wife received a message that she had a package for pickup at the shipping company, in the area of London where Sherlock and Watson had met earlier that night. She finished some things around the house, had lunch, and then left for London. Around 4:30 p.m., Mrs. St. Clair was walking down the street by the shipping company when she heard a cry from a window above her. She looked up and saw her husband looking down at her, almost as surprised as she was. She cocked her head. What was he doing there? She said that he disappeared quickly, like someone had pulled him from behind. He was up on the 2nd floor, and she frantically tried to find the right door, and that led her to a sunken, stinking entrance to the opium den. She was not thrilled about trying to storm a Victorian-era opium den to retrieve her husband, but she swallowed hard and descended the stairs. She made it almost to the bottom before a proprietor met her with a frown. He said that she was obviously lost and she should make her way back up to the street. She, of course, had other ideas and barked that her husband was there and that she had come to get him out. The proprietor argued that a lot of people's husbands were here, and it was actually really bad for business to let distraught wives in to drag them out. When he pulled himself out of his drug-induced stupor, or ran out of money, then she could meet him outside. Until then, he and his large Danish friend would be happy to escort her back to the street. Mrs. St. Clair looked up to see an imposing Danish gentleman, a good 2 heads taller than her or the guy who ran the opium den, but she was determined and glared fearlessly at both men. She was going to get her husband back, and she was not taking no for an answer. Unfortunately, that was the only answer the clerk was willing to provide, and soon they were shoving her forcefully out on the street. Mrs. St. Clair recomposed herself and left to find a constable. Together they pounded on the now locked door of the establishment. After several minutes and several threats, the owner opened the door to the opium den to allow the police inside. The manager of the place was adamant that he didn't know any Neville St. Clair, and there hadn't even been anyone in the front rooms anyway today. The only person even on that floor was just a crippled beggar that the manager of the opium den let sleep there, / couldn't get rid of. As they inspected the room, the constable looked the manager up and down. He seemed like a straight shooter, in comparison to the panicked wife who swore she saw her husband there. It seemed obvious that the wife was deluded. All that changed, however, when they found something strange. The blocks. The ones that Neville St. Clair had left early to pick up for his son. They had been flung behind a table. He had been there. The constable called over more men, and they combed through the rooms where the wife had seen him. And there, next to the table, they found blood. In the connecting bedroom was an open window that dropped straight down to the sea. On the sill were more drops of blood, and there were even more on the floor. Stranger still was the fact that all of Mr. St. Clair's clothes were shoved behind a curtain. Everything except his coat, boots, hat, socks, and watch were there. There was no other exit, other than the one by which the wife had entered the building, and the secret body chute to the river, so the police assumed Neville had gone right out the window. The first suspect was obviously the extremely upstanding gentleman who owned the 19th century opium den, and sometimes dropped bodies of his patrons in the river after robbing them. But he had an alibi. Mrs. St. Clair. She had been at the door within seconds of seeing her husband, and the man had met her on the stairs. Furthermore, he demonstrated complete ignorance of Mr. St. Clair's existence, and swore he had nothing to do with the disappearance, which, yes, was impossible to fake. That led the police to Mr. Hugh Boone. Hugh Boone was the crippled beggar that lived on the floor where Mr. St. Clair had disappeared. Every morning he would drag himself down the stairs, and he was nearly impossible to ignore. He had a shock of orange hair and a massive scar running from his eye to his lip, making the lower lip protrude and causing him to look like a disfigured bulldog. After dragging himself outside and a few blocks away, he sat cross-legged with a greasy cap in front of him, rain, snow, or shine, living his life as a beggar. And he was likely the last person to see Mr. St. Clair alive. Things started going very much not well for Mr. Boone after the police turned their attention on him. As it turned out, the front room, the room where Mrs. St. Clair had last seen her husband, was the very room Mr. Boone rented with whatever change he could muster. And when he couldn't scrounge enough together, he still slept there, because it's not like an opium den is picky about people wandering in off the street. Further complicating the situation, Mr. Boone's arm was streaked with blood, and the beggar protested that it was from a nail that he had cut too close that morning, and the blood on the windowsill and the floor were his. He didn't know how the clothes had gotten there, and Mrs. St. Clair? She was mad. He didn't know any Neville St. Clair, and he definitely hadn't seen him on this floor. The police left to talk about it a bit, and then they came back and stared flatly at the man. That story was all very nice, but he was under arrest. It only added to their suspicion when the tide went out that night, and Mr. St. Clair's coat was found in the river. It had been weighed down by coins, the ones that you would get by begging on a well-to-do city street. Because this is Victorian literature, Mrs. St. Clair had fainted at the first sight of blood on the window, so she had to be taken home. Hugh Boone was escorted to the police station, and everything appeared pretty straightforward. Mr. St. Clair had been pushed out the window by Mr. Boone, and, in an attempt to hide the crime, He was in the process of weighing down the clothes with coins, the only thing he had on him. He made it as far as the coat when he heard the persistent Mrs. St. Clair and the constable banging on the front door. So he went to the hall and sprawled out to look inconspicuous when they inevitably came up the stairs. The details of the case were this. St. Clair got his wife's attention, and then he was pulled into the room. She found the door to the opium den, and the proprietor and his large firm were there immediately. A beggar known as Hugh Boone, a stinking and disfigured man, was the only one on the floor and insisted that Mr. St. Clair was not. Blood, clothes, and toys for Mr. St. Clair's kids were found, and Boone was arrested for murder. St. Clair's coat washed up later that evening, having evidently slipped from his body after he was knocked unconscious and thrown out a window by the crippled beggar. Back in the cab, Watson shivered in the dead of night, and he shook his head, and he nodded. It checked out. No, it doesn't, Watson. Think about it. Why was Mr. St. Clair in the opium den in the first place? Sherlock replied, without even looking over. Opium? He smokes opium? Watson said. It's pretty much the reason anyone goes to an opium den, unless they're looking for a patient or trying out fun disguises. Sherlock shook his head. According to his wife and everyone who knew him, St. Clair was, by all accounts, not someone given to that sort of thing. Watson laughed. Yeah, no one's given to that sort of thing until they are. And Sherlock just described every family of everyone hiding an addiction. Watson turned back to Sherlock with a smirk, but he could see his friend looking ahead, to the estate looming on the horizon. His brow was furrowed, and he was obviously dreading this visit. Before them, holding a lantern, sat Mrs. St. Clair. Mr. Holmes, is my husband dead? Sherlock, hiding his anxiety with agitation, asked if he could have one bite of dinner she had laid out for them before getting into such a heavy question. But Mrs. St. Clair sat waiting. Sherlock sighed and put down his fork. Yes, he's dead. He probably drowned in the river. And that's your professional opinion. When did he die? Mrs. St. Clair shot back. What do you mean when? It was Monday. He was probably knocked unconscious and drowned not 100 feet from where you and the constable pounded on the door. Now, can I please eat? Sherlock said, lifting his fork again. Huh. Monday, Mrs. St. Clair asked, smiling. Then, how is it that I received a letter from him today? What? Sherlock sputtered, throwing down his fork and leaping from his seat. Way to bury the lead, may I see it? She smiled and nodded. Sherlock snatched it from her. He read it aloud. Dearest, do not be frightened. All will come well. There's a huge error which may take some time to rectify. Wait in patience. Neville. Sherlock inspected the letter and put his inductive powers to work. It had been sealed with Neville's signet ring, but that didn't mean much. Anyone could have a ring, and the writing on the envelope was different from that in the letter. The person who addressed the letter didn't know the address either. He or she paused, blotting the envelope, likely to look up the address again. It was written by someone with a dirty thumb, it seemed. The most important thing, it was postmarked with the previous day. It had been sent recently. Sherlock remarked aloud that it could be a forgery to throw him off the scent. But Mrs. St. Clair wouldn't hear it. She was convinced that her husband was still alive. It was definitely his handwriting, too. Sherlock, for his part, agreed that it was the most likely possibility, though it did further complicate an already tricky case. He went back over the bits of the case with Mrs. St. Clair, how she'd seen him in a state of duress, his shirt collar open, how he had yelled to her, and then been pulled back into the room. Sherlock paused and had her repeat that last bit one more time, describing the situation, before letting out an enigmatic, He thanked Mrs. St. Clair. They all ate and talked a bit before Watson and Sherlock retired for the night, to their double bed that they had to share. They had one room open, but only one. As Watson lay down for the night, he had to be thinking that this was not how he thought this day was going to end when he'd woken up. It began like always, going to his practice, and it somehow ended with him not in bed with his wife, but with Sherlock, in Kent. after visiting an opium den. Sherlock sat down on the bed, but immediately rose to go sit in a chair. Sherlock and Watson had known each other for a long time. Watson didn't need to ask what Sherlock was doing. He knew Sherlock could go days without sleep if an interesting problem presented itself. The detective removed his waistcoat and collapsed in a chair with a pipe, with way too much tobacco. Watson, however, could sleep when a problem presented itself, and so he rolled over and shut his eyes. At least he had the bed to himself. "Watson!" Watson heard and shot out of sleep. He thought it was a nightmare, but it was worse. Sherlock was shouting at him to get dressed. They were going for a ride. Sherlock, as it turned out, was a complete idiot, and he was going to fix that. Watson squinted and looked out the window. Sherlock demanded the doctor hurry up. He had already let Watson sleep in. "What time is it?" Watson managed. "Too late. 4:15 a.m. Ah, there he is," Sherlock said when he heard noises from the stable below. The stable worker was the same one Sherlock had camping out for him the other night, and the one he had subsequently abandoned in the neighborhood by the opium den. Sherlock had told him he had until 11 a.m. to sleep, so you can imagine his horror when the detective was standing over his bed and stinking of tobacco at 4. By the time the horses and Watson were ready, it was after 5, and by the time the sleep-deprived riders were in London, the earliest of risers were already at work, and the city in general was starting to awaken under the haze of industry. Sherlock wouldn't tell Watson anything more than that the key to it all was in the bathroom. He had taken it from their house, and it was in this bag. Soon, they found themselves on Bow Street, in front of the Metropolitan Police Station. The officers saluted Sherlock and allowed him to pass. He had been working with them for years, so he had no issue getting in to talk to a prisoner, even a murder suspect, even Hugh Boone. The investigator on the case was happy to let Sherlock and Watson talk to the man, if they could stand the smell. Sherlock cocked his head. Didn't they wash prisoners? The inspector shrugged and admitted that they tried, but Boone had fought them. The most they could do was wash his hands. His face was still nearly black with soot. The inspector remarked that it didn't matter. Boone would be convicted, and then he would get a proper prison bath, which, an 1890s prison bath does not sound like the type of bath you ever want to take. Sherlock smiled. When they were done with him, he would be a respectable, upstanding citizen. When they arrived at the cell, both Watson and Sherlock couldn't believe the smell of the man. Watson looked on his sleeping face and the thick grime that covered it, and that, quote, couldn't conceal the man's repulsive ugliness. "He's a beauty, isn't he?" the inspector remarked. "Yeah, he needs a wash," Sherlock replied, "and I thought he might, so I brought my own tools with me." And the detective reached into the bag he had been carrying and pulled out a massive sponge. Sherlock told the inspector to open the door quietly, and then he would do what they couldn't. He was going to give Hugh Boone a bath. Quietly, Sherlock lifted a nearby pail of water off the ground and crept into the cell. The inspector was surprised by just how quiet Sherlock could walk into the cell, but Watson shrugged. He could see Sherlock was going to sneak up on a deranged murderer and give him a compulsory bath. Watson quietly closed the door to the cell a bit, just in case. Inside the cell, Sherlock dipped the sponge in water, looked one last time on the sleeping face of Hugh Boone, and jammed the sudsy sponge on the murderer's face. There was a shriek and a gurgle as Sherlock gripped the back of the man's head and through clenched teeth said, "Don't fight it, don't fight it. Come on, almost there. All right, all right, all right. That should be good enough." With that, he let go of Mr. Boone's face, and the man rocked backward on the prison cot, gasping for air, face contorted and about to tell the detective exactly where he could put his sponge. But then he registered the inspector's face and Watson's. They couldn't believe it. Sherlock turned with a smile. "Gentlemen, meet Mr. Neville St. Clair." Realizing that he had been found out, St. Clair didn't threaten or curse. He gave them a very dignified nod and then wailed into his pillow. After a solid 30 seconds of emotional outburst, Mr. St. Clair went full Victorian gentleman on the inspector, demanding to know what he was being charged with. He should be free to go, was he not? Why was he being illegally detained? Now, personally, this would elicit a massive eye roll from me. This guy, for whatever reason, pretends to be someone named Hugh Boone and murders himself, refuses to give any details, and then gets all indignant once a bath is forced on him. Luckily, Sherlock picked up the conversation, telling the man that he should have trusted his wife. St. Clair laughed. Yeah, probably, but he'd been lying to her for years. He was more concerned about his children knowing who he was. Hi, sorry, my name's John Watson. Watson spoke up from behind the bars. Full-time physician, part-time assistant detective, or sounding board, or lackey, I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, who are you? Sherlock butted in again, saying that if Mr. St. Clair wanted to see this out and go by way of the courts, then yeah, his children would find out whatever was going on. If, though, he wanted to be polite to the inspector here and tell the whole story, well, then there might not be any reason to detain him. The inspector nodded. Yeah, whatever. St. Clair sighed and started telling the trio his story. Neville's father was a schoolmaster, and he had received a top-notch education. He had a full childhood. He had performed on stage, traveled extensively, and finally took up a job at an evening paper in London. One day, his editor wanted a series of articles on begging in London, and St. Clair had volunteered. His stage days came in handy too. For the article, he made his face up to appear as dirty and as pitiful as possible. He affixed a deep scar and plastered one side of his lip up into a sneer. He found old clothes and found the business district. He played the part, and for 7 hours, he tried his hand at begging for the article. When he returned home, he was shocked by what he had found. He had done so well playing the part of a pitiful beggar that in 7 hours, he made what he usually made in half a week at his newspaper job. And this was a pre-internet newspaper job. So he made some pretty solid money begging. Still, it was wrong. He was playing on these people's charity. He wrote his articles, put the experience behind him, and that was that. Then, disaster came. He had co-signed a loan with a friend a couple years back, a friend who had now just skipped town. The loan was for £25, and he had to beg the creditor for 2 weeks in order to pay the man. St. Clair only made £2 a week from his newspaper job, and he had very little savings. That's when his eyes were turned to the beggar's costume, hanging in the closet. In 10 days, he had the money, and he paid the debt. In the end, it was a fight between his pride and the massive amount of money he could make by just sitting there. A month after returning to the paper, and back to making £2 a week, and he threw up his hands and took to the street. Begging became his full-time job. St. Clair clarified that not every beggar in London could make £700 a year, which was less than what he made, he added. But he was good. With his acting and makeup, he really laid it on. Also, if you're wondering, £700 sterling in 1890, adjusted for inflation, is just about $100,000 a year in 2018. There was only one man who knew a secret: the proprietor of the opium den. St. Clair had paid him enough for that nasty room in which he changed each day for him to stay silent, even with the police breathing down his neck. And even if St. Clair himself was to be executed, St. Clair bought a plot of land in Kent, married his wife, had children, and lived his life as if he had a normal job. She knew he worked in the city, and she hadn't asked many questions. That eventful day, he had yelled out, but it was out of panic that she was right outside his window. When she turned around, he dove back inside. He wasn't pulled as she had thought. He'd army crawled along the floor, too hastily put on his makeup, and had to shove his own stuff behind a curtain. He knew the opium den owner would cover for him, but he didn't expect his wife to be as persistent as to come back with a constable. If they hadn't been so quick in getting up the stairs, the rest of the clothes in the blocks would have gone out the window with the coat. But they were good. Hugh Boone hadn't been arrested immediately, which gave him some time to get the note and a signet ring to the owner of the opium den. Sherlock snapped his finger and nodded. That was why the address looked like it was poorly written by someone who didn't know it. And that was the whole story. The inspector pointed out that was a little far-fetched and a bit unbelievable, but it made sense. Since the case wasn't really public yet, the only people who knew about it were the inspector and Mrs. St. Clair. But for them to forget Hugh Boone must cease to exist. Humbled, St. Clair swore an oath to that effect. The inspector didn't care. He said he had St. Clair's life story, and if he was found again, everything would come out in the press. He was indebted to Sherlock for clearing everything up, and only wished he knew how the famous detective reached his remarkable conclusions. Sherlock laughed. Well, this one started with him reclining on some pillows and smoking some opium. And yeah, Watson, I lied to you last night. I totally smoked opium and then drove us home. Watson sighed, and then remembered that he had better get to work, and explained to his wife why he had disappeared and didn't sleep at home after meeting up with an old friend at an opium den. The story really gives no indication as to whether or not St. Clair intends to tell his wife everything that's been going on, or if he's just going to carry on like nothing happened. Also, he really only swears not to be Hugh Boone anymore. Not that he won't pull a con again. He's gone undetected for years, and he's apparently a master of disguise with limited experience in other fields and a massive hole in his resume. I would not put it past him to totally go back to being a full-time beggar. Hey, I just want to say, thanks for all the amazing reviews on Apple Podcasts. The ratio of 5 stars to anything lower, I just can't believe it. I'm so glad you all like the show. If you like it, just tell a friend about it, tweet about it, put it on Facebook, and when it comes down to it, just thanks for listening. All right, now it's time for the worst of the best. And yeah, we're including superheroes now too. The hero this time is the Red Bee. The Red Bee is not a bee, or really even that red. His real name is Rick Raley, an assistant DA from Oregon. Since he was involved in the government, he was close to City Hall, and he could see what was happening. Organized crime was taking over. Well, Rick Raleigh wasn't going to sit back and let that happen. He did what any concerned citizen would do in that situation. He went home, crafted some yellow and red tights, and spent several months meticulously training bees to fight for him. By day, he was the mild-mannered assistant DA, and also by day, he confused the criminal underworld as the Red Bee. He would fight organized crime, corrupt government officials, and more by, yes, bees. It was usually just one bee, though. He started housing bees in his belt, which just seems like a bad idea, and eventually moved to his, quote, stinger gun, which propelled bees toward their target. Okay, bees already fly, so that just seems redundant. He uses bees to distract and misdirect criminals, and, as most good lawyers do, uses their stings to surreptitiously force confessions on the witness stand. His favorite bee was, of course, named Michael. His MO was to fight his way into organized crime hideouts and get evidence of wrongdoing, anonymously drop it off at the assistant DA's office, his office, and then prosecute based on that evidence. I'm no attorney, but that seems like it would be breaking so many laws, and the evidence would be completely inadmissible. That being said, that should not be construed as legal advice, except that you shouldn't have to dress up as an insect and train bees to commit crimes in the name of justice. That's almost never a good idea. Organized crime and corrupt government officials were one thing, but the Red Bee started in 1940. And you know what started in 1941? The U.S. involvement in World War II. Many U.S. comic book heroes in the 40s took the fight to the U.S.'s enemies, the Nazis. And do you know who was not ready to take the fight to the Nazis? The Red Bee. He and Michael were swiftly murdered by Baron Blitzkrieg, a Nazi villain. I know, Nazi villain is probably the most redundant phrase in the English language. Anyway, half a century later, his grandniece, and yeah, sure that's a thing, named Jenna, discovered her great-uncle's secret and took up the mantle with a bit more seriousness. She made a robot suit to fight crime, and robotic bees, instead of spending months to train one bee to fly across the room and sting one guy and then die. Can't imagine why she made that change. That's it for this time. Today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, and edited and produced by Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by the amazing Breakmaster Cylinder. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.